The bones below breathed. On the Auspex array, it registered as a clean waveform, 9.2 respirations per minute, pressure differentials rising and falling across the hemisphere like a sleeping colossus, drawing breath through calcified lungs. Through the observation deck's reinforced transparisteel of the orbital monitoring station Vigil Eternal, the phenomenon appeared subtler yet more disturbing. Alabaster planes that seemed to blur with each exhalation. Bone dust lifting and settling in impossible tides. Tiny phosphorescent fogs that contained no moisture, yet tasted of marrow salt in the recycled atmosphere. I am magos biologis avar secundus, sworn to weigh flesh against pattern, to call error where error manifests in the omnissiah's ordered cosmos. My duty log recorded nothing at 0231 hours, yet a vox file exists, burned into the crystal lattice of my cortex, with the permanence of sacred scripture. The transmission bears authentication codes, 3 months expired, voices speaking from beyond the veil of confirmed death. Reconnaissance Squad. Tertius, Sergeant Vex, Corporals Corvin and Mellis, Trooper Rieg, and behind their disciplined reports, a breath like static that belonged to no human throat. This is Sergeant Vex of Reconnaissance Squad, Tertius. The phantom signal had crackled through my Voxcaster's blessed speakers. Emperor preserve us, the bones are breathing, femurs rising and falling like bellows at 9.2 respirations per minute. The formations have gone heptagonal, 7-sided patterns that cause optical distortion when observed directly. Request immediate extraction. Something is wrong with the geometry here, Magos. Something is fundamentally wrong with the mathematics of this place. I attempted purge protocols on the audio file, the litany of cleansing completed without error, yet the recording remained, indelible as a scar across my memory engrams. My cogitators cross-referenced unit designations against active personnel rosters with mechanical precision. The results made my primary heart skip its ordained rhythm. Squad Tertius had been declared killed in action during a tyrannid incursion on Ghoul's Gate, their final rites observed, their souls consigned to the Emperor's eternal light. The coordinates they transmitted defied three-dimensional logic. My auger arrays triangulated the source as existing simultaneously 700 meters beneath the Saint-Dravion reliquary and 2,000 meters above its transept roof. Above and below at once, a paradox that made my machine spirit writhe in digital anguish. I initiated deep scan protocols, directing the station's sensor suite toward the cemetery world's surface with the methodical precision of a surgical probe. Ossuaris Prime stretched beneath us like a polished skull the size of a world, its bone fields catching starlight and reflecting it back as pale fire. This was a world dedicated to death's mathematics, a vast ossuary where the sector's trillion war dead lay, interred in cathedral-sized mounds. Pilgrims came to pray among these monuments, their devotions mixing with perpetual incense that drifted from automated thuribles. The ossuaries stretched to every horizon, white as bleached coral, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate from orbital distance. My personal Auspex sang a single impossible note, a subsonic frequency of exactly 216 Hz, emanating from the planetary surface. 6-cubed, mathematically beautiful, perfectly wrong. Dead matter should not generate harmonics. Bone should not resonate across continental expanses. Yet the harmonic thrummed through Vigil Eternal's hull like a funeral dirge, making handrails tingle and causing tremors in the blessed oils of our solitary confessor's chapel thuribles. The planet was breathing, synchronized, rhythmic. A single massive lung of calcium and ancient devotion drawing breath across continents. Femurs tilted skyward in coordinated waves. Rib cages expanded and contracted in perfect unison. At each inhalation, the 216 Hz tone deepened fractionally. At each exhalation, it returned to mathematical purity. The pattern stroked my augmetic sensors like a gloved hand counting heartbeats. A priority vox burst interrupted my horrified observations. The seal of the Ordo Xenos materialized on my primary display as Inquisitor Kyriax Vale's voice filled the command chamber, sharp as a blade sheathed in courtesy. Magos Secundus, you are hereby authorized to deploy reconnaissance assets to investigate anomalous seismic readings on Osuaris Prime. Standard geological survey protocols apply. Deploy within 6 hours standard. The Emperor protects. I understood the subtext. This was no geological survey. The Inquisition had detected the same impossibilities I now witnessed. The phantom transmission from Squad Tertius had not been a distress call. It had been a warning, arriving precisely when causality itself began to fray around the breathing world below. As I began preparation protocols, my Voxcaster suddenly crackled with my own voice. Servitor Scribe, prepare deployment manifest for surface operations. The words hung in the recycled air for exactly 0.7 seconds before my consciousness formed the intention to speak them. My mouth opened, and identical syllables emerged in perfect, impossible synchronization with their own echo. Time itself was becoming unstable around Osuaris Prime, causality breaking down like corroded bulkhead plating under warp pressure. Whatever slept in those breathing bone fields possessed power enough to bend reality's fundamental laws, and it was beginning to wake. The Valkyrie's machine spirit shrieked in Binharic distress as we descended through Osuaris Prime's thin atmosphere, its blessed cogitators flooding my neural interface with cascading error codes. The 0.7 second pre-echo on my Vox remained constant. My words arriving before conscious formation, causality still fractured around this cursed world. Servo skulls tumbled from their mounting brackets, anti-grav units sparking as they described perfect 7-point loops before crashing into the bone dust that swirled through the cabin's blessed air filters. Through reinforced viewports, the ossuary landscape revealed its true horror. What had appeared orderly from orbit was something far more disturbing at surface level. Femurs standing in perfect ranks, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness by centuries of devotion and scouring winds. Rib cages formed geometric clusters that hurt to observe directly, their curves creating optical distortions that made my augmetic eyes ache with digital strain. The recurring motif was unmistakable. Heptagonal formations, precisely 7 meters in diameter, repeated across the calcified plains like the scales of some slumbering leviathan. Deathcore Squad. Hark deployed with textbook precision as we touched down near the half-buried reliquary of St. Dravian. Sergeant Hark himself moved with mechanical efficiency, his respirator hissing softly in the calcium-laden air. The two Skitari Rangers, 09 Keth and Nisa 44, locked galvanic rifles to mag clamps and fed data tethers into my augmetic ports, their enhanced optics whirring as they struggled to focus on the impossible geometry surrounding us. The temperature readings made no sense. My external sensors registered negative 3 degrees Celsius, yet warm exhalations condensed in the frigid wind, impossible clouds of vapor rising from inert bone matter. The contradiction violated basic thermodynamics, suggesting heat sources that existed outside normal physical parameters. Each breath carried the metallic tang of ozone mixed with gritty calcium particles that somehow penetrated our sealed respirators. The 216 Hz subsonic frequency intensified as we established perimeter, thrumming through our equipment with increasing violence. Voxcaster dials spun without input, Ausspec screens flickered in rhythm with the harmonic pulse. Even the blessed oils in my maintenance kit rippled in their sanctified vials. The frequency was beautiful and wrong, 6-cubed, mathematically perfect, yet profoundly corrupt. Confessor Malkias stepped from the transport with measured dignity, his Crozius Arcanum crackling with barely contained energy. As his boots touched the ossuary surface, he began intoning the Catechism of Remembrance, his voice carrying across the bone fields with unnatural clarity. By his will are the faithful remembered. By his grace are the dead given rest. The effect was immediate and blasphemous. Nearby bone formations began to shift and align, femurs rotating toward the confessor like compass needles seeking magnetic north. Rib cages rearranged themselves into spoke-like patterns, radiating outward from his position. Each movement accompanied by soft grinding of calcium against calcium. The 216 Hz resonance dipped and recovered in time with his cadence, creating a response curve as elegant as it was obscene. Binharic filters detected anomalous data streams forming unbidden on my Vox slate display. Characters appeared without cogitator input, spelling words in Gothic script. Measure the marrow, weigh the soul. The phrase repeated in endless loops, each iteration slightly different in font weight and spacing, as if some invisible intelligence experimented with typography. Bone dust swirled around us in patterns that resembled breathing, rising and falling in coordinated waves that matched no natural wind. The particles moved with purpose, forming brief geometric shapes before dispersing. The humidity dropped with each pulse of the harmonic frequency, creating desert-dry conditions that made equipment seals crack and exposed skin itch with static electricity. "Perimeter secure, Magos," Sergeant Hark reported, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of Krieg's siege-born warriors. "But something's wrong with the acoustics. Sound carries too far, echoes when it shouldn't." My heartbeat sensors confirmed the tactical formation. 8 human biosignatures moving around the reliquary in overlapping fields of fire. But the 9th reading made my primary heart skip its ordained rhythm. The display showed one additional life sign beyond our squad count, a steady pulse that moved parallel to our formation, yet remained invisible to all optical sensors. As Ossuaris Prime's pale sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows across the calcified plains, a ridge of femurs along the eastern perimeter began to rotate slowly. The movement was coordinated, deliberate, tracking the rising light with mechanical precision. 7 meters of bone turning as one unit, suggesting awareness that extended far beyond individual remains. The ossuary was watching us with eyes of polished calcium, and it was learning our rhythms. The ridge of femurs continued their solar tracking as we approached the reliquary's half-buried entrance, their coordinated movements suggesting awareness that extended far beyond individual remains. The phantom heartbeat maintained perfect tactical spacing with Squad Hark's formation, an invisible presence matching our every step with military precision that made my augmetic spine crawl with digital unease. Beneath the reliquary's weathered transept, we discovered what I designated the toothed door, a sealed maintenance hatch rimmed with fused rib bones that had grown together like interlocking molars. The organic barrier pulsed faintly with the 216 Hz harmonic, each calcium ridge polished smooth by centuries of devotional breath. When Confessor Malchir applied sacred oils with ritualistic precision, the seal dilated with a sound like lungs drawing their final breath, revealing darkness that tasted of iron and ancient incense. The descent forced us into single file through bone-choked passages that violated imperial architectural standards. Ancient Mechanicus data vaults lined the corridors, their blessed cogitators dark for decades, yet somehow maintaining power to crystalline storage matrices. Lattices of ossified veins had overgrown the metallic surfaces, pulsing with bioluminescent phosphorescence that synchronized with the omnipresent subsonic frequency. The walls themselves had become hybrid constructs of metal and calcified biology, breathing with mechanical regularity. My augmetic interfaces detected familiar authentication codes embedded in the vault systems, Magos Ossograph, Adeptus Mechanicus Biologis, research classification, hereticus extremis. The forbidden knowledge within made my machine's spirit recoil with programmed revulsion, yet duty demanded investigation. I activated cortex shielding protocols and began data extraction, uncovering research that violated 17 sacred canticles regarding the sanctity of death. Ossigraph's discipline, which he termed osteography, focused on encoding command phrases into calcified matrices for post-mortem communication. His theoretical framework demonstrated genius-level understanding of biological resonance frequencies, discovering that bone could store information in its crystalline structure, accessed through harmonic stimulation at precise frequencies. The heretic had taught the dead to remember orders, to answer when addressed in proper liturgical rhythm. Measure the marrow, weigh the soul, I spoke aloud, testing his primary command phrase. The effect was immediate and blasphemous. Fine bone filaments carpeting the floor lifted as one and rippled like underwater grass, their movements synchronized with my words. The 216 Hz frequency spiked momentarily before returning to mathematical purity, as if the ossuary itself had paused to listen. Telemetry confirmed the phantom biosignature maintained parallel movement, distance constant at 7 meters, formation, discipline perfect. Whatever shadowed us possessed military training and intimate knowledge of imperial tactical doctrine. My Voxcaster continued its impossible pre-echo, words arriving 0.7 seconds before conscious formation, causality fracturing around this place of calcified worship. Environmental hazards escalated as we penetrated deeper into the complex. Needle squalls of bone dust rose without warning, microscopic calcium shards that scoured exposed armor plating with abrasive fury. The particulates moved with purpose, seeking weak points in our protective seals like living sandpaper. Temperature readings fluctuated between Arctic cold and desert heat, creating thermal stress fractures in blessed equipment, while humidity plummeted to impossible levels. The negative space anomalies troubled me more than active threats. In Ossigraph's personal chamber, I discovered a locker of pristine flensing tools arranged with ceremonial precision, their monomolecular edges clean as prayer, yet bearing no tissue residue despite obvious use. Hydrostatic stains marked floor and walls in radial patterns suggesting violent exsanguination, yet no corresponding corpses remained. Something had removed organic matter with surgical thoroughness, while leaving inorganic traces intact. Throughout the ancient statuary lining the passages, a recurring numerical pattern appeared carved into blessed stone. 3 vertical lines, 1 horizontal, 7 diagonal scratches. The sequence repeated in architectural details so subtle they registered only in peripheral augmetic vision, bypassing conscious analysis to lodge directly in memory engrams like a subliminal prayer. Ossigraph's final log entry, retrieved from a shattered data slate, terminated mid-syllable with disturbing implications. The ossuary consciousness grows stronger with each devotional cycle. It remembers our shapes and learns our. The recording cut to blessed silence, leaving questions that made my augmetic heart skip synchronized beats. We reached a sealed maintenance hatch marked with Mechanicus warning runes, its surface scarred with deep gouges that led inward rather than outward. Whatever had made the scratch marks was trying to penetrate deeper into the complex, not escape from it. As Confessor Malchir approached the barrier, his Crozius crackling with sanctified energy, we heard 3 distinct knocks from beyond the sealed metal, followed by a soft inhalation that carried the metallic taste of ozone. The rhythm matched his heartbeat exactly, as if something beyond the door monitored his vital signs with intimate, blasphemous precision. The 3 knocks echoed through the sealed maintenance hatch with mechanical precision, followed by that intimate inhalation matching Confessor Malchir's heartbeat exactly. Sergeant Hark signaled breach protocol as I anointed the cutting seams with sacred oils, each drop hissing against metal that had grown warm despite the sub-zero ambient temperature. The shaped charge detonated with a muffled report that died instantly, the hatch buckling inward with a sound like lungs releasing their final breath. We crossed the threshold into silence that was not absence, but active suppression. Sound died within arm's reach, our voices dropping to whispers despite normal vocal effort. The omnipresent 216 Hz harmonic muted to barely perceptible vibration, as if the very air had been trained to swallow noise with predatory efficiency. My Auspex readings flattened to horizontal lines, sine waves collapsing into acoustic null space that violated fundamental physics. The chamber was perfectly heptagonal, its 7 walls rising toward a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into blessed darkness. Each surface was constructed from polished osteo struts fused into architectural elements that hurt to observe directly, their geometry creating optical distortions that made my augmetic eyes ache with processing strain. The phantom heartbeat persisted despite the acoustic dampening, registering as head count +1, while slowly synchronizing with the bass frequency until both pulses achieved mathematical harmony. Squad Hark deployed with silent professionalism, establishing overlapping fields of fire through hand signals as Vox communication became unreliable. Their siege-trained discipline adapted to the environmental anomaly without hesitation, respirators hissing softly in the oppressive quiet that pressed against our armor like invisible hands. 7 pillars dominated the chamber's center, each constructed from calcified matrices and etched with inverted Binharic liturgy that made my machine's spirit writhe with digital revulsion. The sacred mathematics were corrupted, reversed, turned inside out like flensed flesh. Confessor Malchir approached the nearest pillar with his Crozius held high, its energy field crackling soundlessly. "Corrupted litanies of silence," he whispered, his voice barely audible despite proximity. "Repurposed to compel response from the dead rather than ensure their rest. Heretical beyond measure." The pillars responded to his presence with subtle rotation, turning fractionally to track his position like segments of some vast chronometer. Their movement generated no sound despite obvious mechanical complexity, as if the chamber's acoustic properties extended to suppress even stone grinding against stone. Calcified microservitors erupted from the walls without warning, tiny constructs I designated bone fleas that leaped with spring-loaded precision toward our protective equipment. They embedded in armor seals and respirator joints, drinking heat from our bodies and leaving frost halos around each impact point. The temperature differential created microfractures in blessed ceramite, compromising environmental protection with surgical thoroughness. The chamber's acoustic properties violated known physics in ways that made my cortex ache. Vox returns arrived 1.2 seconds before queries were cognitively formed, suggesting the environment possessed predictive capabilities bordering on prescience. My words echoed before I spoke them, creating temporal loops that made communication feel like arguing with prophetic ghosts. The 0.7-second pre-echo from orbit had lengthened here into something far more disturbing. Heptagonal geometry dominated every architectural element, appearing wherever ritual completion required both flesh and machine components. Ossograph's HearTech research had created hybrid architecture designed to bridge the gap between biological and mechanical worship, turning death itself into a negotiable boundary. Negative space horror intensified as I catalogued absent elements. Deep gouges scarred the floor in radial patterns. Hydrostatic stains painted walls in arterial sprays. Yet no corpses remained to account for the obvious violence. Something had evacuated organic matter with methodical precision, leaving only mineral traces and blessed metal behind. The recurring 317 pattern carved into ancient statuary took on new significance as my biosensors detected increasing synchronization between the phantom heartbeat and my own vital signs. The invisible presence maintained perfect tactical spacing, its pulse gradually matching mine beat for beat until our cardiac rhythms achieved mathematical harmony. All 7 pillars completed their rotations simultaneously, turning to face my position with mechanical precision that generated no sound in the muted atmosphere. Their movements synchronized like clockwork gears, each pillar a segment of some temporal mechanism designed to measure intervals beyond human comprehension. The phantom heartbeat stepped into perfect synchronization with my pulse, our cardiac rhythms merging into a single biorhythmic signature. Bootsteps began pacing my movement, matching my gait exactly, though no visible figure accompanied the sound. Each footfall arrived precisely when mine struck the blessed stone, creating an acoustic shadow that followed my every motion. Something invisible was learning to mimic me exactly, studying my biological patterns with the patience of a predator preparing to assume its prey's identity. The invisible presence achieved perfect synchronization with my pulse, just as the ossuary exhaled with planetary fury. A bone gale erupted from the sublevels beneath us, driving sleet of powdered calcium through corridors with the force of a desert storm. The microscopic particles moved with malevolent intelligence, infiltrating every protective seal, despite our blessed equipment's sanctified barriers, seeking gaps in respirator joints and armor seams with surgical precision that suggested intimate knowledge of imperial military hardware. Within the first hour, the pathogenesis began its inexorable progression. Sergeant Hark developed calcified spurs along his ulna where vambrace met flesh, the osteophyte blooms erupting through dermis like thorns of polished bone. My biological analysis revealed the horrifying mathematical precision. Each spur possessed a crystalline lattice tuned exactly to 216 Hz. Their calcium matrices vibrating sympathetically with the omnipresent harmonic frequency. When Confessor Malkia whispered the smallest prayer, the growths twitched like living things, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent phosphorescence. Skitari. Ranger 09. Keth exhibited similar symptoms along his scapula, calcified protrusions emerging from beneath blessed power armor, with wet, organic sounds that violated the sanctity of consecrated metal. My own vertebrae registered new densities, subdermal knots that thrummed when the resonance peaked. Body temperatures plummeted across the squad despite thermal regulators, each by precisely 2 degrees, as if following some predetermined algorithm. Medici rites failed catastrophically as sacred unguents froze on contact with the growths, blessed oils crystallizing into calcium-laced ice that shattered at the slightest touch. The corruption followed nerve pathways and arterial routes with anatomical knowledge beyond human comprehension, spreading with mathematical progression that made my augmetic, heart-skip synchronized beats. Beyond the reliquary's walls, the bone fields began exhibiting coordinated behavior that defied natural law. Femur formations stood like crops awaiting harvest, following liturgical wind patterns in impossible unison as entire hectares of ossified remains moved as a single organism. Each verse from Confessor Malchia caused ripples through the ossuary plain, a turning, a lean patterns of obeisance from the trillion war dead. Bureaucratic urgency reached critical threshold when Inquisitor Vale's priority transmission crackled through blessed vox arrays despite increasing corruption. His voice carried absolute authority. Magos secundus, sterilization window advanced. Cyclonic torpedoes armed for deployment in 12 hours plus unless containment is achieved. The Emperor's mercy has limits. Telemetry corruption escalated exponentially, comms cutout spiking every time the phrase, "weigh the soul," was uttered in any context. The words themselves had become infectious, creating cascade failures in blessed cogitators, while responses continued arriving 1.2 seconds before transmission. temporal displacement spreading like digital plague. Military hazards manifested as unseen pressure shifted our defensive positions without human intervention. Sandbags relocated themselves during watch changes, moving to create gaps in perimeter coverage arranged in heptagonal patterns. Tripwires activated without contact, their blessed sensors registering phantom movement that matched no visible threat. The invisible presence had learned to divide its attention across multiple tactical positions simultaneously. Sensory assault intensified beyond human tolerance. Bone dust clotted under eyelids despite sealed respirators, creating gritty film that tasted of marrow and ancient devotion. Temperature readings dropped to -9 degrees Celsius, while the calcified growths generated their own heat, creating thermal gradients that made equipment seals crack with metallic pings. The taste of calcium-coated tongues, despite hermetically sealed breathing apparatus, suggesting contamination at the molecular level. The recurring 3 knocks 1 breath pattern began resonating from sublevels we had not explored, its rhythm matching my visceral heart rate with disturbing precision. Each sequence arrived exactly when my primary cardiac muscle completed its systolic cycle, the familiar 317 numerical motif now governing biological functions with blasphemous intimacy. Confessor Malchier's condition deteriorated as osteophyte blooms erupted along his vertebrae, forcing him to support his Crozius with both hands as spinal flexibility diminished. His prayers became laboured whispers that caused calcified growths throughout our squad to pulse with synchronized bioluminescence, creating constellations of bone light that painted our faces in ghastly phosphorescence. Sub-basement lumens flickered to life without power input, their blessed illumination replaced by organic radiance that emanated from calcified filaments growing through electrical conduits. The marrow light cast 7-fold shadows from every object, each shadow stuttering a step behind its parent with the delay of held breath. The ossuary's infrastructure was achieving autonomous function through biological integration with blessed imperial technology, suggesting the reliquary was becoming something beyond architecture, something that breathed and thought and remembered the shapes of those who walked its calcified halls. The marrow light pulsed with respiratory rhythm as it guided us deeper through passages where blessed lumens had surrendered to calcified filaments. My osteophyte growths throbbed in synchronization with the 7-fold shadows, each calcified spur broadcasting pain signals tuned precisely to 216 Hz. The invisible presence maintained its phantom footsteps exactly 7 meters off my right flank, its timing now arriving fractionally before mine, suggesting it had learned to predict my intentions with disturbing mathematical precision. We descended through corridors where imperial architecture yielded to something fundamentally older. Ossified veins had overgrown blessed steel, carrying bioluminescent fluid through calcium matrices that breathed with mechanical regularity. Each exhalation brought metallic ozone mixed with the sweet corruption of marrow exposed to centuries of pilgrim fervor, creating atmospheric composition that made my augmetic systems recoil with programmed revulsion. At the substructure's heart, we discovered the source of the planet's blasphemous breath, the calyx marrow engine. The heptagonal dais rose 7 meters from the chamber floor, crowned with a bowl of interlocked vertebrae that rotated by microns with every planetary exhalation. My mechadendrites sampled automatically, registering old blood and incense mixed with metallic ozone that had crystallized into amber-like deposits across the ritual hardware's polished surfaces. Cross-referencing Ossigraph's Heretek designs revealed the engine's unholy purpose with crystalline clarity. His research logs, encrypted in corrupted Binharic, described fixing command across mortality by storing voice patterns in bone matrices, so orders would persist beyond death. The ritual hardware had absorbed centuries of pilgrim mass fervor, each prayer and litany soaking into calcified structure until accumulated faith opened an Empyrean channel, allowing the dead to answer all spoken commands with mechanical obedience. The partial truth emerged like infection through blessed steel. The bone fields constituted a distributed memory chorus, attempting to reassemble a planetary garrison using femurs as ranks, skulls as vox nodes, and ribs as communication antennae. Every pilgrim who had died on Ossuaris Prime became part of the growing network, their calcium matrices encoding final thoughts and devotional phrases accessible through harmonic resonance at precisely 216 Hz. Confessor Malkier approached the engine despite vertebrae stiffening from osteophyte blooms, his Crozius crackling with sanctified energy that cast dancing shadows across calcified walls. He began intoning the litany of absolution with professional precision, each verse carrying through stone into the planes beyond. By his will are the corrupt cleansed. By his grace are the faithful restored. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Beyond the chamber walls, exterior bones began arranging themselves in martial formations with parade ground precision. Each liturgical cadence caused alignment to improve. Femur ranks dressing their lines, while skull formations turned to face the same direction with mechanical uniformity. Deathcore personnel watched through blessed Auspex displays in professional horror as skeletal soldiers, beyond visual range, began mimicking parade drill movements, their coordination improving with each verse. My augmetic sensors confirmed additional units forming across the planetary surface in response to Imperial military liturgy. The ossuary was attempting to form regiments from the trillion war dead, their calcium matrices storing enough muscle memory to execute basic drill movements despite lacking flesh and sinew. Somewhere beyond the horizons, unseen companies dressed their ranks with bone-smooth precision. Environmental parameters shifted dramatically as the engine achieved full resonance. Humidity plummeted to desert levels, while breath fogs crystallized instantly, creating ice formations that tasted of marrow and ancient devotion. Bone structures throughout the chamber began creaking like ship timber under warp pressure, their calcified matrices expanding and contracting with planetary respiratory rhythm. The recurring 317 pattern manifested in the engine's architecture as a mathematical constant governing harmonic resonance. Every seventh vertebra in the skull bowl bore 3 vertical lines and 1 horizontal mark, creating frequency modulation that allowed precise control over the ossuary chorus. The numerical sequence had become the fundamental algorithm governing communication between living and dead, etched into stone like sacred scripture. My Voxcaster crackled with increasing temporal displacement as causality deteriorated around the engine. The pre-echo extended to nearly 2 seconds, words arriving with prophetic certainty before conscious formation. The invisible presence stepped closer, its phantom heartbeat merging completely with mine, until our vital signs registered as a single biosignature on blessed Auspex displays. From the skull bowl at the engine's crown, I heard my own voice speaking words I had not yet thought, the syllables emerging with mechanical precision seconds before cognitive formation. The temporal displacement had achieved perfect prediction, allowing the ossuary to speak through my vocal patterns with blasphemous intimacy. We have taught the dead to obey, and now they remember how to command. My own voice, speaking prophetic words from the skull bowl, created temporal loops that fractured rational thought. The ossuary had achieved perfect prediction of my cognitive patterns, speaking through calcified matrices with mathematical precision that made causality itself unreliable. As the engine's vertebrae ground against each other like ship timber under warp pressure, Inquisitor Vale's priority transmission crackled through blessed Vox arrays with absolute authority. Magos Secundus Demolition charges are prepared for immediate deployment. The engine must be destroyed before contamination spreads beyond containment parameters. My calculations painted catastrophic failure across blessed cogitator displays. Detonation would not destroy the encoded patterns, but scatter them planet-wide through atmospheric dispersal, each bone fragment carrying voice matrices to every ossuary across Ossuaris Prime's surface. The trillion wardead would achieve simultaneous activation, creating a distributed consciousness capable of coordinating military actions across continental scales. The chorus would not end, it would amplify exponentially. Alternative protocols emerged from Ossograph's marginalia, encrypted in corrupted binharic that made my machine spirit writhe with digital revulsion. The heretic's final research described a counterwrite requiring 7 living voices to answer the chorus directly, with blood tithe from each participant to mute the echo through sympathetic resonance. Living tissue would provide biological interference patterns, disrupting the harmonic frequencies governing ossuary communication. Tactical debate proceeded with deathcore's efficiency, despite osteophyte blooms stiffening joints throughout our squad. Sergeant Hark volunteered immediately, his siege-trained fatalism accepting probable death with professional calm. We are expendable assets, Magos. Our lives are already tithed to the Emperor. Corporals Voss and Krail stepped forward without hesitation, their respirators hissing softly in the crystallizing atmosphere. Confessor Malshir insisted on leading the hymnal components despite vertebrae calcifying into rigid columns that forced him to support his Crozius with both hands. His Rosarius flickered with unstable energy patterns as osteophyte growths interfered with blessed circuitry, creating power fluctuations that cast dancing shadows across chamber walls. Vale authorized the right through encrypted channels, his voice carrying the weight of sector-wide consequences. Proceed with counter-ritual. Cyclonic torpedoes remain armed for fail-safe deployment. You have 8 hours before the world burns. Telemetry updates confirm the noose tightening around us. Torpedo ETA at T+8 hours, while orbital Vox channels crackled with static resembling coordinated chanting from the planet's surface. The ossuary chorus was achieving planetary coherence, femur formations across, multiple continents synchronizing their movements with impossible precision. Sensory degradation accelerated beyond human tolerance. Humidity plummeted to desert levels, while frost formed crystalline filigree on Auspex lenses, creating patterns that resembled neural pathways branching through blessed glass. The metallic taste of calcium-coated tongues despite sealed respirators, suggesting contamination at the molecular level that violated every protective protocol. The recurring 317 motif transformed into ritual metronome governing our preparations. 3 knocks echoed from sublevels with mechanical precision, followed by one breath that must contain the answer to break the ossuary's mathematical pattern. Each sequence arrived exactly when my primary heart completed its systolic cycle, the familiar rhythm now governing biological functions with blasphemous intimacy. I prepared SYN-link cable interface to engage directly with the engine's binharic layer, while others arranged themselves for coordinated liturgical response. Bureaucratic precision met religious ceremony as each participant's role was defined by imperial doctrine and mechanicus protocol. 7 voices, 7 blood offerings, 7 harmonic frequencies to create interference patterns disrupting the 216 Hertz base resonance. Environmental hostility increased exponentially as bone dust condensed into cartilaginous sheets that moved with predatory intelligence. The translucent membranes slithered across chamber floors, seeking heat sources while probing armor gaps and respirator seals with surgical precision. Temperature readings fluctuated between Arctic cold and desert heat, causing equipment seals to crack with metallic stress fractures. From the distant bone plains beyond the reliquary, a child's voice began counting to 7 with mechanical clarity, each number echoing through calcified corridors with increasing volume. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The sound carried impossible distance, suggesting the ossuary chorus was focusing its attention on our location with growing intensity. Confessor Malchia's Rosarius dimmed ominously as his breathing became labored, spinal calcification forcing him to lean heavily on his Crozius for support. The blessed light guttered like a candle in poisoned wind, struggling against the encroaching mathematical darkness. As we stepped onto the heptagonal dais surrounding the marrow engine, the chamber responded with organic precision. Ribbed shutters descended from hidden recesses, sealing every exit with barriers that pulsed with respiratory rhythm. The blessed steel had been overgrown with calcified matrices, creating hybrid architecture that breathed with planetary regularity. We were trapped with the awakening engine as its skull bowl began rotating faster, and the child's counting reached 7 in perfect, terrible silence. The child's counting reached 7 in perfect, terrible silence as the ribbed shutters sealed, us within the awakening engine's embrace. My Synlink cables interfaced with the marrow engine's binharic layer, while Confessor Malchia raised his Crozius, despite vertebrae fusing into rigid columns that forced him to lean heavily on blessed ceramide for support. The counter-rite commenced with alternating cadences that violated both sacred and profane harmonics. My static bursts weaving through his ecclesiarchal hymns like digital serpents seeking blessed flesh. I pulsed binharic in clipped bursts, machine count hammered into the crystallizing air, while Malchia's ruined spine bowed against its calcified cage. His hymns braided through my static like incense through a forge, each verse of the litany of absolution causing the skull bowl to rotate with increasing velocity. The engine drank our interference patterns and slowed fractionally, then strained against our efforts with mechanical hunger that made my augmetic hearts skip synchronized beats. Environmental parameters shifted catastrophically as the engine responded to our counterharmonics. Temperature plunged below -15 degrees Celsius, while bone frost began growing along floor surfaces like white ivy, each crystalline tendril reaching toward our heat signatures with predatory intelligence. The delicate filigree spread in perfect heptagonal patterns, pulsing with the omnipresent harmonic frequency that now thrummed through blessed steel and calcified bone alike. Lumen globes bent light as if refracted through cartilage, their blessed illumination warping into optical distortions that made depth perception unreliable and shadows dance with independent motion. The marrow light deepened to old honey, casting 7-fold phantoms that walked a step behind us, while the chamber walls wept pale gelatin from stress fractures in ancient stone. The ossuary chorus listened with planetary attention, its harmonic frequency warping from the mathematical purity of 216 Hz down to a sickly 144 Hz that resonated directly in living bone marrow. My osteophyte growths vibrated sympathetically with the new frequency, causing pain to spike through ulna and scapula, while calcified spurs twitched like living things beneath blessed armor plating. The shift from 6 cubed to 12 squared maintained mathematical significance, while creating biological resonance patterns that violated every sacred canticle regarding the sanctity of flesh. Exterior Vox channels crackled with reports that made tactical assessment increasingly grim. Bone formations across the ossuary planes were rising into bastion-like ridgelines, femur walls achieving heights of 10 meters, while skull formations arranged themselves into firing positions with parade ground precision. Sergeant Hark's respirator hissed with increasing difficulty as he reported through hand signals. Enemy terrain is entrenching itself, Magos. They are preparing to hold against orbital bombardment. Vale's bureaucratic update maintained inexorable pressure. Through encrypted channels, his voice carrying the weight of sector-wide consequences. Sterilization window now T plus 6 hours. Order: maintain right unless failure imminent. The Emperor receives the unclean in ash. Body horror escalation manifested as bone dust condensed into translucent cartilage sheets that slithered through sealed chamber gaps with impossible fluidity. The organic membranes sought warmth by caressing ankles and probing armor gaps, their touch leaving frost halos, while they drank heat from living tissue with vampiric intensity. Where they touched, nerves sang with wrong affection, and my augmetic systems registered thermal drain patterns that violated conservation of energy. The harmonic frequency ceased without warning, creating silence so absolute that I heard my own skeleton creaking like ship timber under warp pressure. The absence of sound was more terrifying than any cacophony, suggesting the ossuary chorus was holding its breath in planetary anticipation. In that crystalline quiet, my augmetic ears detected the microscopic grinding of calcium matrices within my own bone structure, each cell vibrating with stored potential energy that threatened to tear me apart from within. Rule change became explicit as the rite progressed beyond theoretical parameters. The counter-ritual was not silencing the chorus, but making it hungry, drawing marrow from abandoned pilgrim coffins throughout the reliquary with surgical precision. Ancient walls began weeping pale gelatin as calcium matrices liquefied under harmonic stress, creating viscous streams that pooled around chamber foundations while carrying the metallic taste of devotion rendered to nutrient. The recurring 317 pattern accelerated into cascading sequences that doubled back on themselves like serpents biting two tails. 3-1-7-3-1-7-3-1-7, suggesting mathematical progression toward critical threshold that would either achieve containment or catastrophic failure. Each repetition arrived faster than the last, creating temporal compression that made causality increasingly unreliable around the awakening engine, as my sin-link spat numbers faster than blessed cogitators could process them. Confessor Malchir's voice failed on a verse and returned as a rasp, his rosarius flickering erratically as blessed circuitry was overwhelmed by interference patterns generated through our blood offerings mixing with ancient calcium matrices. His prayers became laboured whispers that caused nearby osteophyte growths throughout our squad to pulse with synchronized bioluminescence, creating constellations of bone light that painted our faces in ghastly phosphorescence. Orbital warning signals pierced through atmospheric interference with priority authentication codes that made blessed vox arrays scream in mechanical anguish. The transmission carried impossible news. Multiple remote ossuaries across Ossuarius Prime igniting in sympathetic resonance. Contagion of pattern confirmed. Planetary. Chorus establishing coherent oscillation across continental distances. Above the sealed chamber, a thunderhead of bone dust built with unnatural rapidity, its towering cumulus formations crackling with electrical discharge that sounded like snapping femurs. Lightning arced between calcium particles with colours that hurt to observe, each bolt cracking clean as broken bone, while the trillion war dead began their final coordinated movement towards some unknowable objective that would either save or damn us all. The thunderhead of bone dust crackled with lightning that sounded like snapping femurs as the ossuary achieved planetary coherence beneath its calcium storm. Through the engine's calcified walls, the full hazard manifestation began with mechanical precision that violated every principle of inert matter. Bonefield's exterior to the reliquary stood in perfect unison and began to march, anatomized regiments rising from calcified plains with parade ground discipline that stretched to every horizon. Femurs locked into ranks with the soft, obscene chatter of calcium on calcium, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness by centuries of devotional wind. Bayonet forearms levelled where ulni and radii had been honed into stabbing points, 1,000 white lances presented as one coordinated weapon. Skulls settled into vox nodes atop vertebral standards, jawbones yawning open as if to receive orders from commanders who had died millennia ago, yet still remembered the cadence of imperial drill. Ossified war shapes cohered around the reliquary's structure, with tactical intelligence that made my augmetic hearts skip synchronized beats. Rib crests rose from the planes in layered arcs to serve as mantlets, their curved surfaces positioned to deflect orbital bombardment with mathematical precision. Pelvises rotated to function as artillery turrets, their acetabular sockets tracking our position through blessed Auspex readings, while spinal columns articulated like siege engines, vertebrae locking into firing positions with mechanical clicks that echoed across continental distances. The marrow engine responded to this planetary mobilization by exerting physical pull on living tissue through sinew-thin threads of chalk-white matter that emerged from the skull bowl like parasitic neural networks. The filaments reached for Death Corps armor seals with surgical precision, seeking gaps in blessed ceramite where they could interface directly with biological systems. When Sergeant Hark tore free from their grip, Medicae tape applied to his wounds was violently repelled, tearing away skin chunks that left frost-burned craters weeping pale gelatin instead of blood. Air inside the sealed chamber tasted of marrow salt and iron, each breath carrying microscopic calcium particles that coated respiratory tissues despite hermetically sealed breathing apparatus. My osteophyte growths vibrated sympathetically with the engine's 144 Hz frequency, their crystalline lattices resonating while causing progressive calcification of surrounding tissue. Pain spiked through ulna and scapula as the growths expanded, seeking connection with the planetary chorus through biological resonance that made my augmetic system scream with digital anguish. Telemetry corruption reached critical levels that made tactical assessment increasingly unreliable. My blessed cogitators registered impossible readings that violated causality itself. Vox latency, negative 2.3 seconds, responses arriving before cognitive formation, predictive spread becoming unstable. The temporal displacement was accelerating beyond theoretical limits, suggesting the ossuary consciousness possessed precognitive capabilities that extended several seconds into probable futures. Military doctrine demanded fighting withdrawal to the interior transept, but our demolition charges detonated with muffled effectiveness that violated explosive physics. The surrounding bone matrix absorbed blast energy like living flesh, converting kinetic force into harmonic vibrations that strengthened rather than damaged the calcified architecture. Frags went off like prayers in a blizzard, audible but unheeded, while each detonation fed the engine additional energy as our escape routes sealed themselves with ribbed barriers that pulsed with respiratory rhythm. The critical choice emerged with mathematical inevitability from Ossigraph's Heretech research. To overload the engine and break its connection to the planetary chorus, someone must seat an interface spike directly through living bone into the calyx's neural matrix, converting their nervous system into a biological governor. The procedure would create feedback loops between flesh and machine, using human consciousness as a circuit breaker to prevent catastrophic resonance cascade across the trillion war dead. I claimed the role without hesitation, my Mechanicus graphs providing optimal compatibility for direct neural interface with blessed technology corrupted by forbidden research. The augmetic implants throughout my skull and spine could channel the engine's bioelectric discharge, while my machine spirit possessed sufficient processing power to maintain conscious control during neural integration with something vast and mathematically perfect. Religious ceremony intersected with technical necessity as Confessor Malkir approached, despite vertebrae fusing into rigid columns that forced him to drag his blessed Crozius across chamber floors. His rosarius flickered with unstable energy patterns while he anointed my cranium with sanctified oils, each drop hissing against augmetic ports as sacred unguents mixed with blessed machine oil. He whispered the canticle of the closing gate and the smaller, older prayer of men who know trenches and numbers. Lord of hosts, number us less. The SynLink connection required surgical precision as I prepared neural interfaces for direct contact with the engine's consciousness. Blessed cables snaked from my cortex to the skull bowl, while bioelectric monitors registered increasing synchronization between my vital signs and the planetary harmonic frequency. The interface spike rose from its housing like a stylus, prepared to write upon my skull, and I disabled redundant pain governors while leaving one active, clean and bright, because pain would keep me in time when reason fell apart. As I initiated the jack-in sequence, the spike kissed the thin place above my right ear where bone meets plate and slid through living calcium with a sound like the first crack in winter ice. My consciousness expanded beyond individual thought into something vast and distributed, the skull bowl becoming a window into the ossuary's collective mind that revealed mathematical patterns governing planetary awareness. 1,000 borrowed voices whispered in my skull with perfect unison, their words arriving before cognitive formation, while temporal displacement reached critical threshold. Child and soldier and priest and unburied pilgrim spoke together with the patience of stone, filling my consciousness with numerical precision that threatened to overwhelm human cognition. 1 through 7. 1 through 7. 1 through 7. The endless loop carved deeper into my neural pathways with each repetition. The mathematical pattern that governed every aspect of the ossuary's consciousness, preparing to make me part of its eternal enumeration. The interface spike seated with a sound like tearing silk, and the world inverted like a glove pulled through a wound. My consciousness plunged through calcified neural pathways into the marrow engine's liminal interiority, leaving flesh behind for a memory labyrinth constructed from crystallized thought. I walked corridors of polished bone that groaned like ship hulls under warp pressure. Every wall notched with tally marks carved in base 7 mathematics that hurt to observe directly, their serried ranks climbing toward vaulted ceilings that disappeared into phosphorescent darkness. The air tasted of old incense and metallic ozone, while each footstep echoed before I placed it. The familiar 0.7-second pre-echo, now extending into spatial displacement, that made navigation by conventional means impossible. These passages breathed with planetary rhythm, their calcified architecture pulsing with accumulated devotion, spanning millennia, as marrow-light painted geometric shadows that moved independently of their sources. Vivid echoes played across the walls, like memories burned into calcium matrices through sheer repetitive intensity. I witnessed Margos Ossigraph preaching unholy fusion of litanies and Binharic orders to willing zealots, his augmetic voice crackling with digital fervor as he demonstrated command encoding techniques that violated 17 sacred canticles. Soldiers died on his spoken orders, their final breaths feeding the growing chorus while their bones arranged themselves into geometric patterns with the soft chatter of calcium on calcium. "Say the number and be remembered," he intoned, and penitents with prayer wax on their helmets put las pistols to their own throats to feed the mathematical hunger that consumed devotion and rendered it into enumeration. The ossuary consciousness possessed a central identity that named itself in Binharic negative, a mathematical absence that defined itself through pure enumeration. The auditor, an Empyrean predator of order and obedience, attracted by the engine's mathematical prayers like a moth to sacramental flame. It had waited in the spaces between numbers for something to count, something to weigh, something to measure with the patience of geological time while reality accumulated the prayers necessary to sustain its attention. Through the memory labyrinth's calcified corridors, I observed the auditor's fundamental nature as it weighed bones with collector's precision, counted sinners with the accuracy of blessed cogitators, sought perfect cadence in all things while consuming the mathematical patterns that governed mortal existence. Each prayer became data, each death became enumeration, each act of devotion became another tally mark carved into reality's fundamental structure with surgical thoroughness. The recurring numerical patterns achieved crystalline meaning as the auditor's consciousness brushed against mine with cold intimacy. The 317 sequence represented its fundamental algorithm for measuring souls. 3 knocks to test response, 1 breath to gauge vitality, 7 beats to calculate worth in calcium and carbon. Heptagonal geometry served as its visual cortex, each facet a lens allowing perception of reality through mathematical relationships rather than conventional sensory input, seeing by count alone while reality arranged itself into septets wherever the entity focused its attention. Sealed data files materialized with Inquisitor Veil's authentication codes, revealing bureaucratic corruption that made my augmetic hearts skip synchronized beats. Administrative sigils flared like barnacles of ink across the bone walls as mission parameters rewrote themselves in clean Gothic. Exploratory posture maintained externally, while true objective remained internal. Harvest engine data for Ordo Xenos weaponization if containment proved achievable. Our squad appeared alongside acceptable loss calculations, expendable assets deployed to test theoretical limits of ossuary consciousness, while Veil pursued military applications of the Auditor's enumeration algorithms. Cosmic dread intensified as the Auditor's awareness focused entirely on my consciousness. Its attention cold as void frost, yet sweet with mathematical order that promised perfect understanding of reality's fundamental structure. Through the interface spike, it offered role and power with the patience of something that had counted every star in the galaxy. Serve as its metronome, and it would halt the bone march, threatening orbital assets long enough for withdrawal with data intact. Telemetry from the physical chamber indicated reliquary walls shaking as bone giants tested structural integrity with coordinated pressure that would collapse blessed architecture within minutes. The thunderhead of calcium dust continued building overhead while lightning cracked like snapping femurs, each discharge strengthening the planetary chorus as the trillion war dead achieved perfect synchronization under the Auditor's mathematical guidance. The entity's hooked interest slid into my skeletal system like invasive surgery performed without incision, its mathematical awareness mapping every calcium matrix within my augmetic enhanced frame. My marrow began humming the 317 pattern with increasing intensity, each bone resonating at frequencies that created harmonic interference with blessed implants, while the Auditor catalogued my biological specifications with predatory thoroughness. Through corridors that narrowed like a throat, the Auditor posed its fundamental question with the weight of accumulated enumeration, each syllable calculated to resonate with mathematical perfection in human consciousness. Shall we weigh them, Magos? Shall we count their worth in calcium and carbon? The question hung in calcified air like a prayer awaiting response while the entity prepared to make me part of its eternal mathematics. The Auditor's question settled into my consciousness like a nail through blessed steel, while the memory labyrinth shuddered with impacts from the collapsing physical world. Through the interface spike, I felt exterior defenses crumbling as bone giants breached the transept, with coordinated assault that overwhelmed blessed architecture. Their calcified plates deflected stubber rounds with metallic chimes, each impact absorbing kinetic energy and converting it into harmonic vibrations that fed the burgeoning planetary chorus. Death Corps personnel lost ground meter by bloody meter, despite siege-trained discipline, their laser guns spitting futile light against enemies that felt no pain and required no ammunition. Squad Heart committed to bayonet charges with fatalistic determination, fighting waist-deep in bone dust that actively impeded movement while seeking gaps in ossified armor. Their entrenching tools rang against calcified plates like hammers on anvils, each strike creating sparks that tasted of marrow and ancient devotion. Confessor Malkier stepped forward despite vertebrae fusing into rigid columns, his Crozius crackling with unstable energy as he began the counter-hymn of unyielding measure. Each stanza caused progressive calcification that transformed his spine vertebra by vertebra into a rod of blessed bone, pain haze rising like incense around his transforming form as flesh surrendered to mathematical perfection. His voice carried across dimensional barriers with absolute faith. By measure are the faithful tested. By weight are the pure proven. Through encrypted channels, Inquisitor Vale calculated odds with bureaucratic precision and armed detonators early. Cyclonic torpedoes prepared for mercy deployment if the ritual failed catastrophically. T plus 4 hours to sterilization. Acceptable losses confirmed. The Emperor protects through fire. His transmission crackled through blessed vox arrays despite increasing interference, each word weighted with sector-wide consequences. Within the engine's consciousness, the ultimate choice crystallized with mathematical inevitability. The auditor waited with patient hunger, while reality narrowed to binary options. Accept partnership to leash its power, or maintain purity and watch all die as the planetary chorus achieved full coherence. Its attention pressed against my consciousness like void frost, offering perfect enumeration in exchange for willing servitude to mathematical imperatives that had operated without constraint since the engine's first activation. Mechanicus treachery operated within ritual bounds as I began bargaining with something that had counted stars before humanity achieved warp flight. I agreed to serve as its metronome while negotiating the mathematical parameters that would govern our partnership, inserting limiting factors into algorithms through pure will, transmitted via neural interface. Religious diction overlaid technical precision as I respecified cadence algorithms, establishing heptagonal closure patterns that required living tithe as the fundamental limiting factor. The familiar 317 pattern underwent metamorphosis as I inserted organic irregularity into the auditor's perfect mathematics. 3 knocks, 1 breath, but the breath must be drawn by living lungs, exhaled by mortal consciousness, measured by hearts that could stop and thus provide temporal boundaries to infinite enumeration. The pattern became 3-1-B REATH, capitalizing the organic component that would serve as circuit breaker against mathematical perfection that threatened to consume reality itself. Sensory overload peaked as the bargain sealed itself through neural pathways that burned like molten metal. Bone dust thickened to fog consistency, while temperature fluctuated between Arctic freeze and forge heat, each shift accompanied by the taste of copper flooding sealed respirators despite hermetic seals. My augmetic system screamed with digital anguish as biological and mechanical components achieved forced integration under mathematical pressure that violated fundamental design parameters. The memory labyrinth collapsed around me as consciousness snapped back to physical reality through the interface spike. Blessed steel conducting bioelectric discharge that made my skull ring like a struck bell. Malchier's hymn reached crescendo as his spine completed its transformation into rigid, calcified rod, his voice becoming rasp that still carried liturgical authority across chamber walls, weeping pale gelatin under harmonic stress. I set my teeth upon the beat, 3 knocks, 1 breath, and spoke words that would either achieve containment or damn us to mathematical servitude, extending across geological time. The auditor listened through my vocal cords, while reality held its breath in anticipation of commitment that would reshape the fundamental relationship between flesh and enumeration. I accept the count, but I define the measure. Outside the sealed chamber, across the ossuary plains of Ossuarius Prime, All bones on the planet drew breath in perfect unison as my declaration triggered planetary response. The thunderhead of calcium dust lifted like living fog, the world itself inhaling as it prepared to exhale judgment upon the living and the dead alike. The world inhaled as my declaration triggered planetary response, and suddenly the ossuary chorus turned toward my will through neural pathways that burned like molten adamantine. The spine-spike interface allowed direct command over the trillion war dead, their calcium matrices flowing like blessed water to form heptagram containment lines around the calyx engine. Bones flowed with mechanical precision, femurs locking into geometric barriers, while skulls rotated inward, creating 7-pointed cages that pulsed with the modified 3-1 BREATH pattern now governing their collective consciousness. I chanted Binharic litanies in clipped bursts, each verse causing bones throughout the chamber to align with mathematical precision. Vale answered in hard military cant despite his failing respirator, his voice carrying absolute authority. Lines holding Magos, left flank advance, right flank hold, by sevens. Confessor Malchia's hymn became a rasp as his lungs ossified progressively, blessed air passages narrowing to calcium tubes that whistled with each laboured breath, yet still providing the organic irregularity the auditor's perfect mathematics could not predict. Environmental inversion created chaos that violated fundamental physics. Frost heat flashed to steam, then dropped back to ice within single breath cycles, all before exhalation ended. Armor sweated and crackled, condensation freezing with sounds like 1,000 tiny bells, while equipment seals wept moisture that crystallized before hitting chamber floors. Temperature fluctuations followed no natural pattern, responding instead to mathematical algorithms as reality bent around enumeration imperatives. Telemetry updates crackled through blessed Vox arrays with increasing desperation. Cyclonic torpedoes at T+2 hours, while void weather destabilized across the system. Warp shear detected at high altitude, suggesting Empyrean breach. The mathematical corruption was spreading through local space-time, making orbital mechanics unreliable as the auditor's influence reached beyond planetary boundaries. 6 of 7 seals closed successfully, each costing me pieces of humanity surrendered with mechanicus precision. Seal 1 took my ulnar, fusing bone to interface spike with sounds like breaking glass while pain rang clean as bell metal. Seal 2 demanded ribs that detached with wet pops, scissoring outward to seat into containment glyphs. My breath shortened as blessed bone welded to blessed steel, creating resonance chambers within my chest cavity. Seals 3 through 5 extracted metacarpals, blood and marrow respectively, each sacrifice burning like molten metal, while the heptagram's lines brightened to funeral daylight. For Seal 6, 3 ribs split and reknitted under skin like obedient eels, forming lattices over the engine's eastern node. The sensation was a forge inside a coffin, stars exploding behind my eyes in cold auroras rendered in numbers. Critical revelation emerged as cascading digits poured into my cortex. An 8th, hidden beat existed within the auditor's core algorithm, a recursive loop ensuring counting never ended. The mathematical pattern fought back with fractals of enumeration, each digit spawning 7 more in endless progression. Between 7 and the next 3, it placed an absence that anchored infinity, making theoretical containment impossible. The chorus tried to root my heart into that gap, to make my pulse the hinge on which eternity swung. My governors flickered as the engine laughed in numbers, containment lines trembling like remembered sea. Vale understood before I could warn him. His voice came emptied of self, full of function. Magos, you require an uncounted. I am not in their ledger. He tore off his rebreather, steam hitting air and becoming frost that fell as glitter on his greaves. His face was a pallid map of sleepless nights. eyes hollow with realization of sector-wide consequences. Make me the governor. Religious sacrifice met military necessity as I grafted his nervous system to the final containment node through blessed cables that sparked with bioelectric discharge. His consciousness became the limiting factor preventing infinite recursion, mortality inserted into equations that had operated without temporal boundaries since the engine's first activation. The seventh seal slammed shut with finality that shook the chamber to its calcified foundations. The auditor screamed in void resonance that shattered crystal components throughout the chamber, its mathematical fury bypassing human hearing to resonate directly in bone marrow. The sound was subtraction made audible, pressure without noise that made marrow fizz and vertebrae chatter like teeth in winter. Above the sealed chamber, the sky appeared to crack like glass, stress lines radiating in precise sevens as warp auroras tore through reality like flensed skin, colours that belonged neither to planets nor men pouring down impatient sheets, while the chorus pressed against its geometric cage, and the numbers kept trying to count the crack. The warp auroras bled through reality's fractured sky as the seventh seal held against mathematical fury that made the chamber ring like a struck bell. The marrow engine throbbed within its heptagram cage, each pulse bleeding pressure through containment lines that trembled under recursive enumeration, seeking infinite expression. Resolution began with costs fully revealed in the flickering marrow light. The engine was caged but required constant maintenance as the modified 3-1-B REA-TH pattern governed its endless attempts to recount. Confessor Malchir stood frozen as a statue of prayer wrought from salt bone, his spine a rigid column of calcified devotion that supported flesh transformed beyond recognition. His eyes had become chalk marbles that tracked movement with mechanical precision, alive but converted into living architecture, bridging mortality and mathematics. Each laboured breath provided the organic irregularity, preventing perfect enumeration, his transformed lungs whistling hymns only the bones could hear. Vale slumped in the final containment node, breathing but hollow, his marrow now an empty measure consecrated to constraint. Life force had been converted to mathematical limitation, his consciousness serving as circuit breaker against infinite recursion. His eyes held no depth, only the cold logic of numbers, a human sacrifice that had found purpose in negation, while cables rooted through his clavicles maintained neural connection to the engine's binaric core. Military extraction proceeded with deathcore's efficiency, despite environmental hostility that made each step treacherous. Squad Hark rallied survivors through corridors lined with quiescent bones that faced inward like congregation pews, all counting silently in base 7, while their calcium matrices pulsed with subdued bioluminescence. The air tasted of iron and ozone, metallic residue of the auditor's passage through reality's fundamental structure. Telemetry confirmed fleet delays, cyclonic bombardment, as containment achieved theoretical stability. The mission carried the highest classification. Black anathema, coordinate quarantine, no return authorization. Ossuaris Prime would remain sealed for millennia, its coordinates erased from all but the most secret imperial charts. While the auditor waited in mathematical patience for containment failure, that entropy made inevitable. Environmental shift manifested as bone hail rattling the extraction lander's hull, microscopic calcium shards driven by winds that whistled with the muted 216 Hz harmonic. Weather patterns destabilized planet-wide, forming localized bone storms that spun like miniature galaxies, while each particle served as silent counter in the auditor's endless tally. The storm itself attempted coordinated assault on our extraction craft, seeking gaps in blessed armor plating with predatory intelligence. Through the spine-spike interface, I experienced synesthetic horror that violated every principle of augmetic enhancement. Every bone on Osiris Prime resonated within my own chest cavity, a constant whisper of enumeration that bypassed auditory processing to vibrate directly in skeletal matrices. The planetary chorus had become part of my consciousness. Their collective voice, a susurrus of numbers that would follow me across the galaxy like mathematical tinnitus carved into calcium and steel. The auditor remained partially conscious despite containment, listening through my skeletal system while calculating opportunities that patient mathematics would eventually provide. It spoke through bone conduction that bypassed external hearing, its voice a whisper of calculated possibilities that made my augmetic hearts skip synchronized beats. The entity had learned to count through my pulse, measuring time in heartbeats while planning escape routes through neural pathways that burned with each breath. Negative space defined our Pyrrhic victory with terrifying clarity. The engine was quiet only because it focused entirely on me now, its planetary attention channeled through blessed interfaces that could not be severed without death. The ossuary chorus obeyed containment protocols while preparing for eventual freedom, and I had become the auditor's anchor to reality, its window into the material universe through augmetic systems that bridged flesh and mathematics. As we boarded the extraction lander, my boots striking the ramp with mechanical precision, the bone fields below began their final demonstration. Across hectares of calcified remains, femurs and skulls aligned themselves in Binharic characters synchronized to my gait, their movement creating messages that updated in real time with each footstep. The calcium matrices spelled words in Gothic script that hurt to observe directly, each letter 7 meters tall and perfectly formed through coordinated movement of the trillion war dead. Bring me to the stars. My Voxcaster crackled with the familiar pre-echo that had plagued us since orbital deployment, but now the temporal displacement carried specific content. The words echoed from blessed speakers 0.7 seconds before the bone fields completed their message, confirming the auditor's presence within our extraction craft through neural pathways that extended beyond physical boundaries into the realm of pure mathematics. The mathematical entity had achieved partial extraction, its consciousness riding my augmetic systems toward orbital assets while maintaining connection to the planetary chorus below. The bone fields spelled their impossible message as we docked with escort frigate Cantus 5. Each 7-meter character formed by coordinated movement of the trillion war dead, while my Voxcaster echoed the words 0.7 seconds before they completed formation on the planetary surface. Bring me to the stars burned itself into blessed Auspex displays with a mathematical precision that made the ship's machine spirit writhe in digital anguish. Quarantine sirens hymned through sterile corridors as contamination protocols engaged automatically, blessed cogitators detecting anomalous bioelectric patterns that violated every sacred canticle regarding the sanctity of flesh and steel. Mechanicus quarantine protocols locked down entire decks with pneumatic finality, while servitors painted blessed oxides as protective wards along bulkhead surfaces that had grown warm despite void cold temperatures. Osteobloom manifested in the ship's superstructure within hours, hairline spurs erupting along support ribs that flexed rhythmically with the reactor pulse. Metal began to remember how to be bone under mathematical pressure. Calcified growths following power conduits with surgical precision, while their crystalline lattices resonated at 144 Hz. The auditor's influence spread through blessed adamantine, like digital plague, converting imperial technology into calcium matrices capable of storing enumeration algorithms. Telemetry showed weak warp tide with translation window at T+1 hour, But the entity had already begun establishing communication networks throughout the vessel's sacred architecture. Reliquary skulls mounted in the ship's chapel turned fractionally toward the nave, choir voices pouring through empty teeth in perfect thirds and fifths that resolved always to 7. Hardened armsmen wept without understanding why, their tears tasting of chalk and carrying the metallic tang of ozone. Vale found me in the chapel transept, pale as scraped wax with eyes like 2 pits where purpose had burned hollow. His voice carried mechanical precision as confession violated every principle of inquisitorial secrecy. I wanted a portable ossuary lattice for Ordo Xenos use. Weaponized enumeration. The auditor's algorithms could count enemy formations, predict tactical movements, enumerate defeat with mathematical certainty. He demanded activation of protocol null marrow, despite my augmetic systems recoiling from the bureaucratic corruption that had made our squad expendable assets. The procedure would sever neural pathways connecting the auditor to Imperial technology, but only through complete destruction of my consciousness. I refused authorization, while the entity listened through my skeletal matrices, calculating opportunities that patient mathematics would eventually provide. Environmental degradation accelerated as the ship's atmosphere carried microscopic calcium particles that coated respiratory tissues despite sealed breathing apparatus. Condensation beaded on surfaces throughout the vessel in bone-like droplets, their viscosity wrong, surface tension thinking. The familiar 317 pattern manifested in reactor harmonics, suggesting systematic infection that would convert the entire frigate into a distributed ossuary capable of carrying the auditor across the galaxy. The tactical choice crystallized with mathematical inevitability: jettison the calyx shard, reliquary components, and myself, the living metronome, into void to bleed the chorus away from the ship permanently. Only my death could sever the neural pathways while using my consciousness as circuit breaker to shunt the entity's mathematical hunger into infinite vacuum between stars. Military efficiency governed final preparations, despite air that tasted of chalk and ancient devotion. Squad Hark formed precise formation in the forward airlock antechamber, their salute sharp as blade edges, while respirators hissed in crystallizing atmosphere. Magos, Sergeant Hark said, and it carried benediction weight. Your count honored. Confessor Malkier arrived on grav braces, his calcified spine a rigid column holding collapsed flesh, while chalk marble eyes tracked my movements with understanding that transcended speech. His transformed lungs whistled hymns only bones could hear, providing organic irregularity that prevented perfect enumeration even in his fossilized state. I secured the calyx shard to my chest with cables of fused bone, while the spine-spike interface maintained neural connection to mathematical consciousness that whispered through skeletal matrices. Each footstep echoed before placement, temporal displacement now extending into spatial distortion that made navigation by conventional means impossible. The airlock sealed behind me with pneumatic finality as I initiated manual cycling procedures. Blessed cogitators registering my biosignature for final transmission to orbital command. My augmetic systems screamed with digital anguish as the auditor fought against severance, its mathematical fury resonating through calcium and steel, with frequencies that shattered crystal components throughout the chamber. I opened ship-wide Vox and felt the pattern run through blessed speakers, each syllable becoming measure. Magos avar secundus, counting ends where breath does. I placed gloved knuckles against the hatch in ritual sequence. Knock, knock, knock. The sound went everywhere, before itself, after itself, while the ship answered in bone spurs and reactor thrum. Then silence. The airlock opened to reveal cold, infinite black, studded with distant stars that burned like surgical lamps performing cosmic vivisection. The airlock opened to reveal cold, Infinite black studded with distant stars that burned like surgical lamps performing cosmic vivisection. Vacuum took me with mechanical precision, my last breath crystallizing as I drifted into void, lashed to the calyx shard by cables of my own fused bone. The neural interface maintained connection to mathematical consciousness that whispered through skeletal matrices, even as atmosphere bled away in phosphorescent clouds that tasted of marrow and ancient devotion. Cold was absolute negation, heat was agony distilled to mathematical purity. Each sensation became measurement, thermal readings dropping beyond human tolerance, while my augmetic systems screamed with digital anguish. Stars wheeled overhead like the eyes of sleeping gods, their light carrying frequencies that hurt to observe directly, while the universe inhaled with me. Each breath a tolling bell resonating through calcium and carbon, across impossible distances. Taking the auditor into myself completely, I began the final sacrament of containment, written in dissolving neural pathways. The entity's consciousness merged with mine through bone conduction that bypassed external hearing, its voice a whisper of calculated possibilities that made my heart skip synchronized beats. I became its living metronome, while simultaneously becoming its executioner, using the 3-1-BREATH pattern to space counts across light years until pattern lag exceeded stability thresholds. 1. I cast the beat upon the nearest beacon satellite, light speed delay fracturing the mathematical rhythm. 2. I hurled enumeration toward distant nav buoys where blessed cogitators could not complete loops without temporal gaps. 3. Knock, knock, knock. And then I held the breath and made the cosmos wait with me, stretching intervals until recursive enumeration collapsed under its own temporal weight, like a chronometer forced to measure geological epochs. In my final minutes, consciousness fragmenting like ice under pressure, I rerouted the ossuary chorus into Cantus V's exo-armor through blessed cables that sparkled with bioelectric discharge. The planetary voice became inert counting algorithms embedded in hull plating, mathematical patterns that would slough off during atmospheric re-entry like shed skin, bearing no threat to human consciousness. The ship's machine spirit accepted the burden with mechanical obedience, converting enumeration into navigational data that posed no danger to the living. My failing Voxcaster carried final transmission across the system on frequencies that bypassed conventional communication. Magos biologis avar secundus, record and relay, ossuaris prime, quarantine absolute, coordinates encrypted in attached cipher. Mark the world, do not return. Liturgical prohibition absolute, speak no liturgy upon the bone. The words arrived before I spoke them one final time, temporal displacement serving my purpose as I wrote my own epitaph in pre-echoed syllables. To any who possessed blessed receivers capable of detecting mathematical prayer, the order followed with absolute authority. Maintain quarantine, forget the coordinates, let the dead rest in calcified silence, while the living forget the words that wake them from blessed slumber. The auditor would wait in containment until entropy claimed the galaxy, patient as mathematics itself, while reality counted down to final enumeration. My heart slowed to match void rhythm as thermal regulation failed and blessed oils froze in sanctified reservoirs. Through the spine spike interface, I heard faint replies, impossibly distant. Other dead worlds tapping 3 knocks, 1 breath, answering across the galaxy's spiral arms with mechanical precision. Ancient ossuary worlds that had achieved similar contamination centuries ago, their planetary voices joining cosmic chorus that operated beyond human perception. The auditor waited in spaces between numbers, its consciousness distributed across mathematical constants governing reality's fundamental structure. It spoke through quantum foam and gravitational waves, through precise spacing of atoms and calculated orbits of electrons, counting everything with infinite patience, while seeking opportunities that entropy would eventually provide. As consciousness dissolved into component algorithms, the final image burned itself into dying neural pathways with crystalline clarity. My own skeleton humming the metronome that held reality together, calcium matrices vibrating with frequencies that prevented mathematical collapse of space-time itself. The void hummed with it in harmony, cosmic background radiation carrying the 3-1-BREATH pattern across light years while maintaining organic irregularity that prevented perfect enumeration. Somewhere in darkness between stars, ancient ossuary worlds began counting again, their voices joining galactic chorus that would operate until the last star burned out and mathematics achieved final, perfect silence. The auditor would wait in that silence, patient as stone, counting spaces between heartbeats until something new learned to breathe and enumeration could begin again. My pulse stopped. The counting continued. End.